Imagine a girl born behind coal stones and quiet corridors, raised in a world where daughters were not loved for who they were, but valued for how far they could be pushed. Mary Boleyn, the woman history casually labels the other Boleyn girl, was far more dangerous to the Tudor throne than anyone dared write down. Her life did not simply intersect with power. Her life shaped the very bloodlines that would one day rule modern England. And the tragedy is that almost no one realized it while she was still breathing. Mary entered the world around the year 1499, or perhaps 1500. Her birth was not considered important enough to record properly. A daughter was a tool, nothing more. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, fluent in several languages and hungry for elevation, looked at Mary and did not see a child. He saw opportunity. Before she was even a woman, he sent her to France, straight into the glittering, venomous world of royal courts. And in France, the rumors began, rumors that would return like a knife decades later. A French bishop claimed that the young King Francis had once called Mary the English mare, a crude insult, a blow meant to stain the entire Boleyn name. But that accusation came more than 20 years later, in a moment when destroying Anne Boleyn was a political sport. Whether it was truth or poison did not matter. Rumor is a weapon, and Mary was its first wound. When she returned to England, she did not come home. She returned to duty. She was married in the year 1520 to William Carey, a man chosen not for her heart, but for the Boleyn ambition. On the day Mary stood at the altar, King Henry Tudor watched from only a few steps away. That gaze, quiet and calculating, was the first sign of the storm tightening around her life. In the years that followed, Henry wanted her, and wanting, for a king, meant taking. There was no consent in Tudor England when the king desired you. There was only the illusion of choice. Mary's husband did nothing not out of kindness, not out of fear, but because the king's pleasure bought him land, money, and position. Mary became a silent battlefield between two men, one powerful enough to take her, the other weak enough to hand her over. During this period, Mary bore two children, Catherine in the year 1524 and Henry Carey in the year 1526. Many historians believe both carried the king's blood, but Henry VIII never acknowledged them. He acknowledged another illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, and fed him wealth and titles. But Mary's children were left in the shadows because admitting the truth would have forced the king to confront a sin that terrified even him. He had slept with one sister before marrying the other. Silence protected him and erased Mary at the same time. Then the world tilted. Henry cast Mary aside and turned his obsession toward her younger sister, Anne Boleyn. Anne watched what had happened to Mary, watched how a king could use a woman and throw her away, and she swore she would never suffer the same fate. She refused Henry's advances unless he made her queen, and the king tore England apart to obey. He broke from Rome, shattered centuries of religious unity, defied the Pope himself, all to claim Anne. While Anne rose higher and higher on Henry's fevered devotion, Mary faded like a forgotten shadow, a price paid without applause. In the year 1528, William Carey died of the sweating sickness, leaving Mary a widow with two small children and almost no money. The woman who had once shared a king's bed now struggled to afford food. Anne, still only the king's intended bride, sent her sister a small allowance out of pity. Mary slipped quietly into the background of Tudor power, nearly erased, until she did something that terrified her entire family. She chose love. In the year 1534, Mary secretly married William Stafford, a poor soldier with neither title nor wealth. She chose him without permission, without asking the king, without bowing to her family's ambition. For a noblewoman, this was an act of rebellion as bold as shouting in the king's face. Anne now, Queen Anne Boleyn, banished her sister from court. Their father disowned her. Her allowance vanished, and Mary wrote a letter that cut through centuries of silence like a blade. I would rather beg my bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom. While Mary lived hidden in the countryside with the man she loved, the Boleyn family collapsed in the most violent way imaginable. Anne gave Henry a daughter, the future Elizabeth, but no son. The king grew cold. Then he became cruel. He used Mary one final time to justify his new desire. He declared that his marriage to Anne was cursed because he had once slept with her sister. That word sister became the justification for Anne's destruction. In the year 1536, Anne was arrested, accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges twisted out of thin air. Mary's own brother, George, was executed beside her. Their father sat on the council that condemned his children, and Mary, she survived. She survived because she had already lost everything worth taking. She spent the last years of her life in quiet countryside poverty. No palace, no title, no honor, just freedom. When Thomas Boleyn died in the year 1539, Mary inherited a small portion of the estate, enough to secure her children's future. She died on the 19th of July in the year 1543, her grave unmarked, her location uncertain, her name nearly forgotten. But her legacy was not. Her daughter Catherine became a respected courtier. Her son Henry VIII rose to become one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisors. Through them, Mary's bloodline spread through the aristocracy and eventually into the veins of modern royalty. Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles III, Princess Diana, all descended from the woman the Tudor court tried to erase. Mary Boleyn did not die a queen, did not die wealthy, did not die honored, but her blood outlived them all. And when you look at the royal family today, you are staring at the triumph of the woman history tried to call nothing. This is only the beginning, because Mary's tragedy is not the story of a victim, it is the story of a woman who broke her chains, vanished from history's stage, and yet rewrote the future of an entire monarchy. It is quiet now as we return to the beginning, to the place where Mary first opened her eyes to a world already waiting to use her. Hever Castle in Kent does not roar with history, it murmurs. The stones hold warmth only in the mornings, when mist still clings to the garden ponds and the old apple trees drip dew like slow tears. Mary Boleyn learned to walk on those stones, her small hands brushing walls that had existed long before she could understand their weight, her feet tapping on floors built not for children, but for ambitions older than her bloodline. In that soft cradle of privilege, Mary did not yet know she was being raised as a promise, a bargaining chip, a polished jewel meant to attract the right eyes. She only knew the sound of her sister's footsteps beside her, the bright laughter of Anne echoing through the corridors, and the gentle voice of her mother, Elizabeth Howard, who carried the pride of the mighty Norfolk line like a cloak too heavy to ever remove. The rhythm of Mary's childhood was not shaped by freedom, but by expectation. Lessons in reading and writing began early, her tutors correcting the tilt of her quill with patient authority, her small fingers learning to glide across parchment with elegance because grace would one day matter more than honesty. Music floated through those rooms, notes played on viols and lute strings that quivered whenever gentle hands plucked them, and Mary learned to mimic those delicate sounds. In those long days, she was praised when she behaved like a lady, scolded when her heart leaned toward laughter too wild, corrected when her imagination wandered where duty said it should not go. Every rule shaped the girl she would become, yet beneath it all, something tender pulsed inside her, a softness, a warmth, a yearning that could never fit comfortably inside the rigid shell her family built around her. Mary spent her earliest years watching her father come and go in fine clothes, scented with the dust of court and the smell of distant embassies. Thomas Boleyn was a man who admired refinement, but he admired advancement far more. When he knelt before King Henry VII, or later before the young Henry VIII, he knelt with a mind always calculating, and in quiet moments, when he returned home, he observed Mary with the same thoughtful eyes, assessing not her laughter or innocence, but her potential value. She was lovely even as a child, it was clear, and beauty was a currency no diplomat would ever waste. In Hever's peaceful gardens, while Mary chased swans or plucked petals from blooming roses, her father was already imagining the courts she would one day walk in, the alliances she might help him forge, and the doors her smile could open. Even Anne, younger and brighter like a flame that refused to dim, grew up under that same watchful expectation. But while Anne resisted, Mary adapted. She learned that pleasing others was the easiest path to a quiet life. She learned that being agreeable made adults smile. She learned that softness protected her from conflict. It never occurred to her then that softness would also make her easy to push, easy to shape, easy to sacrifice. Childhood gifted her tenderness. The world she entered later would punish her for it. Sometimes, in the dying light of late afternoon, Mary would stand on the stone bridge that arched over Hever's moat, gazing at her reflection trembling on the dark water below. She would hear the distant calls of servants closing the castle gates for the night, the quiet thud of iron meeting wood, locking away a world she barely understood. The moat's surface rippled with whispers of the future, reflecting a girl who did not yet know how fragile her place in this world truly was. To her, everything seemed stable: the castle, the gardens, the warmth of her mother's hand, the certainty of her father's return. But beneath that fragile certainty, history was already tightening its grip on her life. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, belonged to one of the most powerful families in England, and this bloodline meant that even Mary's silences mattered. Elizabeth taught her daughters to stand straight, to curtsy with perfect precision, to speak French with a graceful lilt, to move their hands as delicately as if the world were watching. Because one day, the world would watch. Mary learned early that her worth would be measured not by who she was, but by how she appeared, how she behaved, how well she played the part. In a world where women were doors, she was being polished into a key. At night, when candles burned low and the castle creaked in the quiet cold, Mary and Anne would lie in their shared chamber, whispering secrets beneath the heavy blankets. Anne's voice was clever and sharp even then, dreaming of courts and queens and futures where she controlled the room rather than drifting through it. Mary's dreams were softer, unsure if she even wanted a future shaped by others' desires. But her gentleness betrayed her, because gentleness in the Tudor world was not a shield, it was a vulnerability. Anne dreamed of crowns, Mary dreamed of kindness, and kindness was the first thing the world would take from her. Hever Castle shaped Mary, but it also disguised the dangerous truth, the peace she felt there was borrowed time. For noble daughters, childhood was only the opening act before the true performance began. And as Mary grew taller, as her hair shone brighter in the sun, as her French lessons grew more refined, her father's gaze sharpened. Opportunity was gathering like a storm cloud on the horizon. Across the English Channel, the French court glittered with danger and promise, a place where alliances were forged with smiles sharper than daggers. When Thomas Boleyn learned that Princess Mary Tudor would travel to France to marry King Louis, he made a decision that sealed his eldest daughter's fate. Hever had been a cradle, but France would be the forge, and Mary, gentle Mary, would soon discover that the world waiting for her was far darker than the quiet stone halls where she had learned to dream. The departure from Hever did not feel like a beginning to Mary. It felt like being lifted from warm soil and replanted in a garden where no one cared whether she bloomed or withered. When Thomas Boleyn placed his daughters on the road toward the coast, his voice was calm, almost proud, but there was a tension beneath it, the kind that grows in a man who knows he is gambling with living pieces. Mary was barely more than a child when she stepped aboard the ship that would carry her across the channel, the cold wind whipping her hair against her cheeks as if the sea itself were warning her of the life waiting on the far shore. She watched England fade behind her, thinking of Hever's gentle lawns and her mother's soft hands, not knowing that she would never again see the world with such childish certainty. France welcomed her, not with warmth, but with spectacle. The royal palaces rose like stone giants, draped in banners, perfumed by incense, crowded with courtiers whose smiles hid calculations sharper than knives. Princess Mary Tudor, sister of the English king, had arrived to wed King Louis of France, and the court thrummed with the anticipation of alliance, wealth, rivalries, glares, and whispers. Mary Boleyn did not matter to anyone there. She was a young lady in waiting among many, a decorative ornament placed where politics needed her. Yet even then, the French air settled on her skin differently than the air of Hever. Something in it was heavier, richer, tempting, and dangerous, like wine left too long in the sun. King Louis was old, frail, and decaying before her eyes. Mary watched him shuffle through the great halls, his face pale beneath his crown, his breath shallow as though his lungs were already preparing to surrender. 3 months after their wedding, he did. His death did not provoke mourning. It triggered opportunity. In a court where survival required speed, the atmosphere shifted instantly, and Mary found herself swept into the household of the new queen, Claude. Queen Claude was gentle, reserved, almost ghostly in her stillness. But her husband Francis was nothing like her. King Francis was young, charming, golden with confidence, and the court, like a restless beast, moved with him. The French court was nothing like the rigid English formality Mary had been taught. Here everything breathed faster. Silk rustled more dangerously. Laughter carried secrets behind it. Men and women spoke with boldness, flirtation, and arrogance, their eyes scanning every room for advantage. Mary felt herself pulled in two directions, dazzled by the beauty of the court, yet unsettled by its hunger. She was expected to be graceful but not naive, alluring but not careless, useful but not too visible. Queen Claude's household offered guidance, but even there Mary sensed the unspoken truth: kindness was scarce, and innocence was a luxury reserved for those who would never pay the cost of losing it. Rumors cling to beautiful young women in dangerous places, and Mary discovered this long before she understood how cruel words could be. King Francis had a reputation as a collector of pleasures, and the court watched every woman who passed before him with a gaze that judged and speculated. Mary did not seek his attention, did not flirt, did not chase admiration, but still the whispering began. Perhaps someone disliked the English girls. Perhaps someone envied their positions. Perhaps it was nothing more than the ordinary malice of bored courtiers. Yet whispers, once spoken, move faster than truth. There were murmurs that Francis had called her names crude, mocking names, and though no documented proof existed then, the rumors lived on like bruises pressed into her legacy. Mary tried to keep her head low, to behave exactly as she had been trained, but France was too alive, too sharp for such meekness. The dances glittered with wealth and temptation. The banquets carried a feverish energy that lifted even the shyest into reckless enjoyment. Mary, still young enough to be enchanted, found herself swallowing fragments of that brightness. She laughed more freely than she ever had in England, spun in circles during dances with girls her age, and tasted the sweetness of attention not yet poisoned by consequence. France drew her out of the quiet shadow she once lived in, teaching her that there was more to life than obedience. But every lesson came with a price. By the time her father called her back to England, Mary understood that she was no longer the girl who had left Hever. She had learned secrets of courtly life she would never confess aloud. She had watched how men measured women, how alliances were shaped through whispered conversations in candlelit chambers, how a single misstep could stain an entire family. And somewhere deep in her mind, a quiet fear had begun to grow, fear that her father would look at her and see not a daughter returning home, but a rumor he needed to bury. When Mary re-entered English soil, the wind felt colder, as though the country she had left behind could already sense the invisible marks France had carved into her spirit. Her father greeted her with a blend of relief and urgency, his eyes scanning her face for any hint of trouble. No matter how carefully Mary carried herself, no matter how softly she answered questions or how obediently she returned to the rhythm of English court life, Thomas Boleyn could sense that something fragile had shifted. The whispers from France had sailed across the channel. They waited for her in the corners of every room. It was then that Thomas made his next decision, one that would bind Mary's life to the destiny of the Tudor throne. He arranged her marriage to William Carey, a respectable man close to King Henry, a safe choice in theory but a doorway in reality. In Thomas Boleyn's mind, Mary needed stability, protection, a place where rumors would dissolve. What he did not realize was that by placing her near the king in the very heart of royal intimacy, he had set her on a path far darker than anything France had ever threatened. Mary had left Havre, stepped into France, and returned unknowingly prepared for the storm ahead. Her lessons in charm, grace, obedience, danger, and silence had shaped her into exactly the kind of woman a king might notice. And Henry Tudor was already beginning to look. The world that awaited her was no longer about dancing or whispered intrigue. It was a world where the king's glance would become a sentence, where her gentleness would become a trap, and where everything she had learned in France would be twisted into tools she never wished to wield. The stage was shifting beneath her feet. Though Mary did not yet know it, she only sensed that something vast and unstoppable was moving toward her, as quietly and inevitably as the tide pulling her childhood away forever. The English court had always breathed with a kind of restless hunger, but Mary did not truly feel its weight until she returned from France and stepped into the gilded rooms of Queen Catherine's household. The air there carried a constant tension, hidden beneath polished manners and ritual bows, and Mary sensed immediately that she was being measured, not for her innocence, not for her virtue, but for the quiet glow she carried from her years abroad, the confident tilt of her head, the foreign softness in her gestures, the French lilt lingering in the way she formed certain words. Everyone noticed changes she did not even realize were visible, and in a world where the king's gaze could transform or destroy, visibility was both a blessing and a curse. William Carey, the man chosen as her husband, greeted her with polite affection. Yet she sensed a distance in him, an awareness that his marriage bound him more to her family's ambitions than to any personal desire. He was kind enough, dutiful enough, and comfortable enough in his position near King Henry. But Mary could feel the quiet machinery of court life turning beneath the surface of every interaction. She acted her part with grace, smiling when expected, speaking softly when asked, never stepping outside the boundaries set before her. Yet the harder she tried to shrink, the more attention she seemed to draw, as though the very effort to be invisible created a glow she could not extinguish. It happened gradually, and then suddenly, the way storms often do. Mary began to notice the king's eyes lingering on her during court festivities, watching her as she poured wine at the queen's table, as she danced in carefully measured steps, as she moved through rooms lit with torches that cast trembling shadows over stone floors. Henry Tudor was in the prime of his life then, a man not yet crushed by age or bitterness, still shaped like the knight he desperately believed himself to be. He carried himself with an ease that disguised the danger beneath his charm, and Mary understood instinctively that his attention was not a compliment. It was an omen. Henry was a master of approach. He did not storm into a woman's life. He circled it, drawing nearer in slow, deliberate arcs. He began by speaking to her at feasts a gentle question about the queen's comfort, a light remark about the music, a fleeting comment about France that showed he remembered where she had been. He asked about her family in a tone that suggested warmth, but Mary could sense the calculation beneath each phrase. The king did not ask questions without purpose, and the court held its breath every time he addressed her in public. Silence spread in thin ripples, carried by the awareness that a new story might be beginning, a story capable of swallowing entire households. She tried to avoid him, stepping behind ladies-in-waiting when he entered a room, lowering her gaze when he walked past. Yet avoidance only fueled pursuit. Henry was a man accustomed to winning tournaments, battles, arguments, and affections. Averted eyes became invitations. Hesitation became a lure. And one evening, when music spilled through the great hall like golden smoke, he spoke to her in a lowered voice that pressed every boundary she had been taught to respect. She felt her breath catch, not in excitement, but in quiet dread, because she knew there was no safe way to answer. A king's interest had only one possible direction. Her family saw it before she admitted it to herself. Thomas Boleyn's expression sharpened whenever Henry drew close. Her uncle from the Howard line watched with a careful intensity that made Mary's skin prickle. Even her husband, William Carey, stepped aside with a stiff politeness whenever the king entered a conversation. Mary could feel their expectations tightening around her like fine silk cords. They did not warn her. They did not shield her. They did not tell her she could say no. They only watched, waiting for her to become useful. Mary's world shrank to small, suffocating spaces, dim corridors where she felt footsteps behind her, private chambers where she could not trust silence, feasts where she felt the king's eyes follow her, as though she were the only candle burning in a dark room. She prayed for an escape that did not exist. In Tudor England, a king's desire was not a request, it was fate wrapped in velvet. And the women chosen by Henry never walked willingly. They walked because every path away from him was lined with ruin. When Mary finally understood she could not outrun him, the realization settled over her like frost. She carried the weight of her fear without speaking it aloud, because even admitting it would have been dangerous. And as Henry drew her into his private orbit, she felt the life she might have had slipping silently from her grasp. Days blurred into nights. Discretion became necessity. Her husband's silence became complicity, and Mary stepped into a world she had never chosen, a world where her body became a whisper exchanged by nobles, a favor granted by her family, a decision she was never asked to make. Yet beneath this frightening surrender, something else unfolded, something she would one day look back on with an ache she could never put into words. Mary began to sense the quiet fading of her own identity. The girl raised at Hever, gentle and curious, drifted further away with each moment she stood in the king's presence. She learned to speak softly even when her heart pounded, to hide emotion when the world demanded a calm face, to smile when she wanted to turn away. She became a master at pretending she was not unraveling. The court saw only the surface, a pretty woman receiving the king's attention, but inside her, a shadow lengthened. She could feel the danger growing, hinting that the romance others imagined was in truth a tightening cage. Henry's interest was not a blessing, it was a slow eclipse. And somewhere deep inside, Mary sensed that the darkest part of her story had only just begun. What she did not know, what no one could yet see, was that the king's gaze toward her was only the first tremor. The true quake would come later, when the same gaze shifted away from her and landed on someone standing very close. Someone who shared her blood. Someone who would one day wear a crown Henry had never intended her to reach. There comes a moment in certain lives when silence becomes so heavy it begins to sound like a heartbeat. For Mary, those years beside King Henry were carved entirely from that kind of silence, a silence that wrapped itself around her throat whenever she entered a chamber where the king waited. A silence that clung to her skin even when she returned to her husband's house. A silence so complete that she sometimes wondered if the world had forgotten she possessed a voice at all. The court whispered. Of course it whispered, but the sound never reached her ears in any form that could save her. It drifted like mist, curling through the halls, filled with speculation, jealousy, and cruel delight. Yet none of it spoke the truth she carried inside, that she was trapped in a place where every breath felt borrowed and every smile felt rehearsed. Henry's charm was a weapon, and he wielded it with the ease of a man who had never been refused anything he desired. He lavished Mary with attention that to the outside world seemed tender, considerate, even romantic, yet to Mary it felt like standing too close to a fire that never stopped growing. She could not step back without burning everything her family relied upon. She could not step forward without losing herself. The king's affection was not a soft embrace. It was a tightening grip. His compliments poured over her in polished phrases. His hands guided her through dances with an authority that left no space for hesitation, and his private visits came like clockwork, leaving Mary with the constant ache of knowing that her life no longer belonged to her. William Carey, her husband, moved through these years like a blurred figure at the edge of a painting, present but distant, benefiting quietly from the king's favor. Mary sometimes searched his face for anger, for sadness, for any sign that he saw her suffering, but instead she found a practiced neutrality, the expression of a man who understood the cost of resisting power. Perhaps he feared losing everything. Perhaps he convinced himself this sacrifice was temporary. Or perhaps he simply accepted the strange arrangement because so many husbands at court did the same when fortune demanded it. Whatever the reason, his silence deepened hers. And then came the children. The first arrived in the year 1524, a daughter with soft skin and bright, searching eyes. Mary held her close, inhaling the warmth of her tiny body, feeling for the first time in years a heartbeat against her own that did not belong to a king or a court or a man who saw her as currency. She named her Catherine, a name that carried dignity and gentle strength, yet as she whispered the name into her daughter's hair, an unspoken question hung over them both. Whose child was this? Did she belong to William Carey, who held her with polite affection, or to Henry Tudor, who never touched the child but cast glances toward her with a flicker of something unreadable in his expression? No one asked out loud. No one dared. The silence around Catherine's birth grew thick, a fragile veil that everyone pretended not to see. Mary felt a strange mix of love and fear whenever she looked at her daughter, as though Catherine herself held the delicate balance between ruin and survival. A reminder that intimacy with a king left marks that could not be erased. 2 years later, the second child came. A boy, Henry Carey. His arrival in the year 1526 struck Mary with a force she could not bear to speak of. The court noticed details: the shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose, the small but unmistakable echoes of royal features, but everyone looked away when those resemblances grew too sharp. Gossip fluttered like uneasy birds above the court, but never in front of the king. Henry Tudor acknowledged another illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, with great fanfare, granting him titles and lands. But Henry Carey, the child whose face seemed to carry the king's shadow, that boy was left unnamed by the man whose blood many believed ran in his veins. Mary felt the wound of that silence deeper than any humiliation she had endured. It was not that she wanted recognition, it was the sharp cruelty of being erased. Her son was raised in the half-light of possibility, neither fully legitimate nor fully acknowledged. A child born of a woman the world believed the king had tired of. Mary saw the world through new eyes after her son's birth, understanding that even innocence could be twisted by power. As the years passed, the king's attention began to shift like sunlight moving across a fading tapestry. He grew restless with Mary, distracted by politics, by entertainments, by everything except the life he had altered in ways she could not repair. Mary watched him look at her less often, speak to her with less warmth, summon her with less urgency. She felt the cage loosen, but not in a way that offered escape. It loosened because he no longer cared to hold its door closed. Then one evening, during a celebration filled with lute music and laughter, Mary noticed Henry's gaze drifting towards someone else, a girl she had known all her life, a girl whose eyes held ambition rather than fear, a girl whose mind glittered sharp as polished steel, her sister, Anne Boleyn. The king watched Anne the way he had once watched Mary, but with something new in his stare, something more consuming, more dangerous, more willing to burn the world to possess her. Mary felt the moment like a cold wind sliding beneath her skin. She did not feel jealousy, at least not the simple kind. She felt the ache of a memory pressing against her ribs, reminding her how quickly affection turned into confinement, how love from a king was less like a bloom and more like a wildfire. She feared for Anne, even as she feared for herself, and slowly, painfully, the king stepped away from Mary's life, leaving behind a silence so vast it threatened to swallow her. The court, once so eager to whisper her name, now whispered Anne's. The favors that had once been thrown at her husband's feet now began to drift elsewhere. The attention that had once consumed her now belonged entirely to the younger sister, whose fate would soon reshape England forever. Mary looked at her newborn son, at her growing daughter, and realized she was no longer the king's desire, no longer her family's prized advantage, no longer the jewel Thomas Boleyn hoped to polish into a political weapon. She had become a piece removed from the center of the board, fading into obscurity while the game continued without her. Yet in that fading, something unexpected began to stir within her, a faint, trembling freedom, not enough to save her, Not yet, but enough for her to breathe again. Enough to spark a quiet thought she had never allowed herself before. If the court no longer needed her, then maybe, finally, she could begin to belong to herself. She did not yet know the price of such a hope, or how completely her world was about to fall apart, or how, in that collapse, she would discover the courage that had been silenced inside her for far too long. There is a peculiar quiet that settles over a person when the storm that once surrounded them simply stops. Not because peace has arrived, but because the noise has moved on, leaving behind an echo that clings to the air like frost. Mary lived inside that strange silence after the king turned his gaze toward Anne. She walked through the palace corridors no longer watched, no longer wanted, no longer whispered about except in the cruel, dismissive tones reserved for women whose usefulness has expired. Servants no longer paused when she passed, courtiers no longer bowed. Even her father's eyes grew distant, assessing, disappointed, as though the brightness she once carried had dulled beyond repair. Mary felt herself shrinking, not because she lacked worth, but because the world around her needed her to become small. She had been a door for her family to walk through, a polished ornament for the king to admire, and now, stripped of value, she was something closer to an inconvenience. Only her children anchored her to a life that felt increasingly fragile. Catherine toddled across polished floors, her laughter ringing like a bell Mary wished she could hold on to forever, while little Henry clung to her skirts with his soft hands. Unaware of the shadows gathering around them, Mary told herself again and again that love would be enough to protect them. She whispered it at night, a prayer, a promise, a lie she needed to believe. Then came the year 1528, bringing with it a sickness that did not knock before entering. The sweating sickness, swift, merciless, infamous for taking lives in a single day, spread through the court like a dark whisper. Mary could feel dread rising in her chest every time she heard of another death. Another noble struck down by a fever that seemed almost supernatural in its cruelty. When William Carey fell ill, Mary stood at his bedside, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from his brow, listening to his breath growing ragged, uneven, distant. He died before she could absorb the reality of it. One moment he was a man, flawed and complicated and silent in ways that had hurt her. The next he was gone, leaving behind a widow with 2 children and a future that looked like a long, unbroken winter. Mary did not weep in front of the court. She held herself together with a quiet dignity that surprised even her. But grief is a creature that does not stay away forever. It visits at night, in the moments when the world lies still. And for Mary it came as a slow, crushing awareness that she was now responsible for everything: food, shelter, safety, and a life where she owned almost nothing at all. William Carey had left debts behind. The grants he'd once received for remaining silent during her affair evaporated the moment he died. The court did not rush to help her. The man who had taken her body, her pride, and years of her life did not lift a finger to ease her suffering. Mary stood at the edge of ruin, and the court, always hungry for tragedy it could consume, barely paused. She was no longer the king's distraction. She was simply another woman struggling to survive in a world that had no interest in her survival. Her allowance shrank to almost nothing. Her residence became uncertain. Servants who once bowed to her now pitied her in hushed tones. Mary gathered her children close, feeling the sharp ache of humiliation as she accepted the reality she never imagined her daughter and son might starve if she did not find a way to feed them. Anne, now rising higher in the king's affections, did something unexpected. She arranged a small annual payment for Mary, nothing that would lift her from poverty, but enough to keep her from absolute despair. Mary accepted it with a mix of gratitude and shame. She watched Anne walking through the court surrounded by admiration and envy. Every step polished, every gesture bold, every word echoing with confidence Mary herself had never possessed. There was pride there, yes, but also a wound. The same man who had once used Mary now tore England apart to possess her sister. It was a cruel twist that Mary could not help but feel deep in her bones. Anne received devotion Mary had never been offered, power Mary had never been allowed to desire. And soon, in the year 1533, Anne would marry the king himself and become Queen of England. Mary observed all of this from the margins, clutching her children's hands, living in rooms that grew colder with each passing month. She had fallen from the shimmering world of feasts and jewels into one where every crust of bread mattered. Poverty is not loud, it is quiet, suffocating in its stillness. It seeps into the joints, into the mind, into the spirit, until even breathing feels like a task. Mary learned to mend torn dresses to make them last longer. She learned to count coins with trembling fingers, to stretch food over days, to hide her hunger so her children could eat first. And yet, in the shadow of that suffering, something inside her changed. It happened slowly at first, like a faint ember glowing beneath the ashes of a life burned away. She began to walk differently, her steps cautious but determined. Her gaze grew steadier. Her voice, when she spoke to her children, carried a strength that had not existed in her earlier years. The world had taken her pride, her position, her safety, her husband, and even the illusion of choice, but it had not taken her will to survive. Mary began to understand a truth she had never dared to consider during her time as the king's mistress. Her life, broken and battered as it was, might still belong to her. She was no longer being used as a tool. She was no longer being shaped by ambition. She was simply a woman standing in the ruins, holding her children close, trying to find a way forward without destroying what remained of her heart. Her suffering had not made her free, not yet, but it had stripped away the chains that once disguised themselves as privilege. And in the quiet, Mary realized she was facing something she had never known before, a future not yet written by anyone's hand but her own. She did not know that love was waiting for her just beyond the edge of that despair. She did not know that another choice, dangerous, forbidden, and entirely her own, would change not just her life, but the course of an entire dynasty. For now, all she knew was hunger, grief, and the distant sound of a world moving on without her. But soon, she would take a step no one expected, a step that would tear open everything the Boleyn name had become and free her in a way no crown ever could. There are decisions that grow quietly inside a person, taking shape long before the moment they finally surface. Mary did not wake one morning and decide she would defy her family, the court, the king, and every expectation that had shaped her since childhood. The courage to do so grew slowly, like a fragile vine pushing its way through stone, nourished by years of being silenced, forgotten, and broken down until only the most essential part of her remained. It was in this stripped-down version of herself, widowed, poor, overlooked, that Mary discovered a truth she had never been taught. She did not need to be wanted to exist. She simply needed to choose. William Stafford entered her life without fanfare, a man of no great name, no great wealth, and no great ambition. He was a soldier, steady and unadorned, a man who could stand in a room without being noticed unless he wished to be. Mary felt an unfamiliar calm in his presence, as though the air around her finally stopped vibrating with expectation. He asked nothing of her. He saw nothing in her except a woman, not a tool, not an ornament, not a political stepping stone, a woman. The simplicity of that recognition felt like a hand placed gently on her chest, steadying a heartbeat that had been trembling for years. In moments when the world grew too cold, Stafford's voice softened the edges of her fear. In the long evenings when her children slept and the candles burned low, he listened when she spoke about things no one had ever cared to hear about: Haver, about Anne's sharp laugh in their girlhood, about the scent of the gardens in France, about the king who had taken what he wanted, about the years she could not erase. Stafford did not interrupt. He did not judge. He did not look at her as though every word she spoke were evidence to be weighed. He simply listened. And in the space between his silence and her own, something began to grow. Mary tried to resist it. She knew too well how the world punished women who followed their hearts. She carried the imprint of that punishment across every memory of her life. She told herself that affection was a luxury she could not afford, that tenderness was a danger she should step away from. But tenderness was exactly what she had never been allowed to keep. And each time Stafford offered it, something inside her bent toward it like a flower leaning toward sun. The decision to marry him did not happen in a burst of passion. It happened in a whisper of exhaustion. Mary had lived for so long under the weight of choices made for her that the act of choosing for herself felt almost sacred. Stafford asked for her hand not as a man claiming a prize, but as someone offering companionship. And Mary, trembling not with fear but with a sense of unfamiliar freedom, said yes. They married quietly in the year 1534, without permission, without witnesses of rank, without waiting for the approval of her family or her king. It was a small ceremony, perhaps only a few words spoken in a modest room, perhaps just the clasping of hands before God and no one else. Yet in that quiet defiance, Mary felt something shift inside her, a final cut severing the chain that had bound her since girlhood. She had done the one thing she had never been allowed to do. She had chosen her own life. But Tudor England does not forgive choices made in the dark, especially when those choices disrupt the carefully woven fabric of ambition. When news of the marriage reached her family, the reaction was not shock, it was fury. Thomas Boleyn, whose life was built on alliances, favors, and strategic placement, could not comprehend that his daughter had thrown away the chance to remain tied to the royal household in exchange for a soldier with no name worth speaking. He disowned her without hesitation, as though cutting her away could erase the shame she had brought. Anne, now Queen Anne Boleyn, reacted with a storm Mary could feel even from a distance. The court whispered of her anger, of her disbelief, of her frustration that Mary timid, pliable, gentle. Mary had dared to undermine the family at the very moment they stood nearest to the crown. Anne stripped her of her position, banished her from court, ended her small allowance, and closed the doors Mary had once walked through with trembling obedience. Mary found herself cast out in every sense: no family, no income, no protection, no place in the glittering world she once served. She lived with Stafford in modest rooms, sometimes in the countryside, sometimes in spaces borrowed or rented. The walls thin, the floors uneven, the nights long. Poverty had already visited her life, but now it settled fully into her bones, reshaping her future into something raw and uncertain. Yet even in that rough and fragile existence, Mary felt a freedom she had never known. She woke beside a man who cherished her. She walked through days that belonged only to her. She cooked her own food, mended her own clothes, and felt the quiet rhythm of a life no longer dictated by royal whims or family ambitions. There was no opulence, but there was peace. And for a woman who had lived for years as a shadow, peace felt like a miracle. Still, the world has a way of testing even the bravest choices. Mary soon faced hardships she had not anticipated. Money remained scarce. Her father refused reconciliation. Even Anne, in her moments of private softness, could offer nothing more than occasional tokens sent in secret: a cup, a coin, a gesture that said, "I love you still, but I cannot protect you." Mary bore it all with a resilience she did not know she possessed, nurturing the quiet life she had built with Stafford, refusing to regret the decision that had freed her soul even as it imprisoned her body in struggle. But freedom never comes without cost, and Mary's cost was only beginning. The winds at court were shifting. Anne's queenship trembled beneath the weight of Henry's disappointment. Whispers grew louder, accusations brewed, and as the storm gathered over her sister's life, Mary stood far away, not knowing that soon she would be forced to watch from a distance as the world destroyed the very woman she had once shared a cradle with. For now, she only knew that she had chosen love, chosen herself, chosen a life stripped of glory but filled with truth. It was the bravest thing she ever did, and it would lead her into a future both cruel and unexpectedly eternal. There are moments in history when an entire world seems to crumble in a single breath. when the great houses built on ambition and hunger cracked from the inside, leaving only dust and echoes behind. Mary felt this collapse not from the center of power, but from its cold and distant edge. She lived in modest rooms far from the shimmering court she had once served, living quietly beside the man she loved, unaware that a storm was gathering with such ferocity that it would tear her family apart. She sensed a shift in the air long before news reached her, a stirring of unease that drifted like smoke through the countryside, whispering of danger, of betrayal, of a king whose affections had curdled into something darker than anger. Anne had risen with a brilliance that dazzled the world, but brilliance is a fragile thing when held in the hands of a king who tires easily. Through rumors that traveled on merchant carts and servant gossip, Mary began to hear that Henry's passion for Anne had started to wane. The Queen had given him a daughter, Elizabeth, bright, sharp, extraordinary, but not the son he demanded. Each year that passed without an heir chipped away at Anne's security. Mary had once lived beneath the weight of Henry's gaze and recognized too well what it meant when that gaze turned cold. She had warned herself that power gained through desire could turn to ash just as quickly. Now she feared her sister was learning that lesson in a way far more brutal than she ever had. Life at court had grown tense, they said. Henry's temper surged unpredictably. Factions circled like wolves, waiting for the moment when Anne stumbled. And above all, there was the woman who haunted every corridor even in her absence, Jane Seymour. Soft, pale, quiet Jane, whose gentleness was exactly the contrast Henry sought after Anne's fire had burned too brightly. Mary heard those whispers with a kind of numbness, knowing that the pattern was repeating itself, that her sister was standing on the same precipice Mary once stood upon, but with the danger multiplied 100-fold because Anne was not merely a lover, she was a queen. Queens did not fall quietly. Queens could be destroyed in ways mistresses never were. Then came the blow that sent tremors across the kingdom. In the spring of the year 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested. The charges were impossible adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king, and yet the speed with which they were believed revealed how eagerly the world had been waiting for her downfall. Mary heard the news in a room so small, the walls felt as though they were pressing in on her. Her hands trembled so violently she could not hold her cup. The sickness rising in her chest made breathing feel like swallowing stones. She did not need to see the accusations to know they were lies. She knew her sister. She knew her ambition, her flaws, her temper, her courage, but she also knew her loyalty, her fierce devotion, her refusal to bend when truth was at stake. Anne had many faults, but treason was not one of them. Mary imagined her sister in the Tower of London, pacing the cold stone floors where footsteps echoed like distant ghosts. She imagined Anne's dark eyes, once filled with fire, now burning with disbelief and terror. She imagined her clasping her hands, whispering prayers, calling for justice in a world that had already decided her fate. Mary's heart cracked open with a pain deeper than any she had felt, even deeper than the humiliation of being cast aside, deeper than the grief of losing her first husband. Family had betrayed her before, but this betrayal was larger than flesh and blood. It was the betrayal of a kingdom that had devoured the woman it once worshipped. As days passed, Mary heard of interrogations, of confessions extracted from frightened men, of names twisted into evidence, of George, her brother, dragged into Anne's downfall. George Boleyn, clever, radiant, beloved by many, was accused of unspeakable crimes, his fate entwined with Anne's in the darkest possible way. When Mary heard that George had been sentenced to die, she felt something inside her collapse. The Boleyn children had once run across Haver's Gardens together, hopeful and innocent, unaware that their futures would be carved into a tragedy neither poets nor historians could soften. Now, two of them stood condemned, and the third, Mary herself, could do nothing but listen as the world tore her family apart. When the day of execution came 19th of May, year 1536, Mary was not at the Tower. She was far from London, far from the sharp metallic scent of blood drifting across the morning air, far from the crowds pressing forward to witness the fall of a queen they had once cheered. But distance did not shield her. The moment the sword descended upon Anne's neck, Mary felt a shudder ripple through her body, as though the blow had struck not stone, but the fragile core of her own spirit. She imagined the stillness that followed, the faint whisper of fabric as Anne's body fell, the eerie quiet of a crowd witnessing a royal death that would haunt England for centuries. Mary did not weep immediately. Her grief was too large to fit inside tears. It pressed against her ribs like a weight she could barely carry, suffocating in its enormity. Her sister was gone. Her brother was gone. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, had sat in the council that condemned them. His silence a wound Mary could not begin to comprehend. The family that had once shone with ambition now lay in ruins, scattered by fear, shame, and the consuming rage of a king who had once claimed to love them. And yet Mary remained alive, not because she was favored, not because she was forgotten, but because she had been cast out early enough to be deemed harmless. Henry no longer saw her as a threat, no longer cared whether she breathed or vanished. In the twisted logic of Tudor politics, the act of cutting ties with her family had saved her life. The very choice that had once brought her shame, her marriage to William Stafford, now stood between her and the executioner's blade. But survival is not the same as living. Mary walked through the days after Anne's death like a woman wandering through smoke, unsure where her steps were taking her, unsure what remained to hold on to. She thought of her sister's laughter, loud and sharp during their childhood at Havre. She thought of Anne's fierce intelligence, the spark in her voice when she spoke of change, of England, of faith, of purpose. She thought of the tiny moments of tenderness they shared, moments overshadowed by ambition but never truly erased, and her grief settled deep in her chest, heavy and unyielding. The world had taken Anne. It had taken George. It had taken everything their family once was, but it had not taken everything Mary would become. Because in the shadows of this devastation, her legacy, the one she never sought, never expected, never even dared to imagine, was beginning to take root in places she could not yet see. In the weeks after Anne's execution, the world felt strangely hollow to Mary, as though a great bell had been struck and left ringing through every corridor of her mind. She had not seen her sister in the final hours, had not touched her hand or whispered any last comfort, had not stood in the tower's courtyard to witness the moment steel separated flesh. And yet the reality of Anne's death pressed against her with a heaviness that no physical sight could have deepened. It was a grief that wrapped itself around her ribs like an iron band, making each breath tremble. A grief not only for a sister lost, but for a childhood that had never truly belonged to them, for the lives they had been forced to play, for the world that had asked too much of them and given nothing back. Mary moved through her days like a ghost, tending to her children, tending to her small household, tending to grief in the quiet corners where Stafford could not see her break. She thought often of George, whose laughter had once filled Havre's echoing halls, a boy too bright to survive the merciless machinery of Tudor politics. She thought of her father, Thomas Boleyn, a man hollowed by ambition, now living with the knowledge that his name had risen with pride and fallen with disgrace. Mary could not bring herself to hate him, though the sharpness of his past decisions stung like old wounds reopened. She pitied him instead, a man who reached too far and watched everything he loved slip away in the king's shadow. But even in her grief, life stirred around her with its own relentless rhythm. The seasons changed. The countryside shifted from green to gold, from gold to gray, from gray back to the soft green of spring. Mary found herself living days that resembled one another so closely that time began to flow like a river without banks, smooth and unmarked. She cooked meals, mended clothes, held her children close during storms, listened to Stafford speak of small village matters, and in those mundane moments, something quiet and gentle began to heal inside her. It was not happiness exactly. It was survival softened into acceptance. Mary had never asked for greatness. All she had ever wanted was a life she could call her own. And in those small years, in the modest rooms far from court, she finally lived that life. Catherine grew into a graceful young woman, her steps steady, her mind bright. Henry Carey grew taller, sharper, carrying an air of quiet confidence that made Mary pause sometimes, seeing in him a faint echo of a man whose blood he might have carried. She never spoke of it. The truth was too dangerous, too tangled. Instead, she poured every piece of herself into them, determined that her children would never carry the same wounds she had been forced to bear. Then, in the year 1539, Thomas Boleyn died. Mary inherited a portion of Hever's estate, not enough to restore the life she once had, but enough to soften the hardships that had shadowed her household. It was a strange feeling to own again a piece of the place where her story had begun, a place filled with memories so tender and so painful that walking through its gardens felt like revisiting a dream half remembered. She wondered whether Anne would have survived differently had she been allowed to choose her own path. She wondered whether George might have lived if their father had been less ambitious. She wondered whether she herself would have been spared so many scars if she had been born into a world that valued daughters not as currency, but as souls. Mary lived only a few more years after her father's death. The exact nature of her final illness remained unwritten by the world that had once documented even her smallest missteps. Perhaps it was the slow exhaustion of a life lived under too much weight. Perhaps it was the grief that had never fully healed. Or perhaps it was simply time. On the 19th day of July in the year 1543, at roughly 43 or 44 years of age, Mary Boleyn slipped out of the world as quietly as she had lived the last years of her life. No great procession marked her passing. No chronicler captured the moment. No grand monument bore her name. The exact location of her grave faded into obscurity, lost to the shifting earth and the fractured records of the Reformation. It would have been easy expected, even for her story to end there, tucked beneath the soil of some unmarked parish, forgotten by the kings and queens who had once shaped her fate. But fate, unlike kings, possesses a peculiar sense of irony. Mary's legacy did not die with her. It began with her children. Catherine Carey entered the service of Anne of Cleves and later the young Elizabeth. She married Francis Knollys, a man of steady character and loyal heart, and their children multiplied across the English aristocracy, weaving Mary's blood through the families that shaped Elizabeth's court. Henry Carey, raised in relative obscurity, became one of the most trusted advisors of Queen Elizabeth I, his cousin, though the truth of that bond remained unspoken. She made him Baron Hunsdon, lifted him into a sphere of influence Mary could never have imagined, and kept him close until the end of her reign. And from these two children, these two forgotten fragments of Mary's life, descended lines that reached into centuries she would never see. Mary's blood moved quietly from one generation to another, seeping into the foundations of houses that would one day trace their ancestry to her name. Through marriages, through births, through the subtle weaving of heritage, her lineage survived every fall, every war, every change of power. Centuries later, when the world crowned a new monarch, scholars traced the lines and discovered an astonishing truth. Queen Elizabeth II carried Mary Boleyn's blood. So did King Charles III, and through another branch, Diana, Princess of Wales, whose sons now carry that same quiet legacy forward. The forgotten sister, the discarded mistress, the woman with no grave, lived on in the veins of modern royalty, her presence subtle, quiet, undeniable. Mary Boleyn never wore a crown. She never sat on a throne. She never commanded armies or shaped policy or held the world's attention longer than a fleeting scandal. But she lived. She survived. She chose love when the world demanded obedience. She chose herself when the world told her she belonged to others. And in doing so, she became the unbroken root beneath the English monarchy, a silent foundation stronger than any gilded crown. History tried to forget her. Power tried to erase her. Even her own family abandoned her. Yet her blood, steady and stubborn, rose higher than any of them. And in the end, when the noise of kings and queens fades into the dust of time, it is Mary Boleyn, gentle, wounded, resilient Mary whose legacy stands untouched, whispering across centuries that sometimes the quietest life shapes the world the most.